year was 1918. The guns had finally fallen silent across the muddy fields of Europe. Millions of soldiers who had survived the slaughter of the First World War walked home through ruins, haunted by memories of death. Cities once alive with industry were now ghostly shells. The air carried the stench of decay and smoke. Families waited at train stations holding faded photographs, hoping to see faces that would never return. Europe called it the war to end all wars. But the peace that followed was fragile and bitter. Entire generations of young men had been erased from history. In France, 1 out of every 5 men of fighting age was dead. In Germany, starvation and despair gripped the people. The British Empire, though victorious, was exhausted and indebted. Across the continent, nations were bleeding, both physically and morally. The 1919 Treaty of Versailles was meant to secure lasting peace. Instead, it created the conditions for another catastrophe. The Allied powers, France, Britain, and the United States, demanded retribution from Germany. They forced Germany to accept full responsibility for the war, to pay immense reparations, and to disarm completely. The treaty stripped Germany of its colonies, its navy, and a large portion of its territory. It carved new borders across Europe, tearing apart old empires and creating new, unstable states. In Berlin, the signing of the treaty felt like national humiliation. Germans called it the Diktat of Versailles. Veterans who had fought in the trenches could not understand how they had lost. They believed they had been betrayed, not defeated. The myth of the stab in the back was born. The idea that Germany's army had been betrayed by politicians, socialists, and Jews. This poisonous lie would later become a key weapon in Adolf Hitler's rise to power. Meanwhile, across Central and Eastern Europe, chaos reigned. The Austro-Hungarian Empire had collapsed, leaving behind fragments. Austria, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and Yugoslavia. The Ottoman Empire disintegrated, its former lands divided between the victors. New nations like Poland and Finland were reborn, but their borders were uncertain, their governments fragile. Old rivalries resurfaced under new flags. Economically, the continent was broken. Inflation spiraled. Currencies lost value overnight. In Germany, a loaf of bread that cost 1 mark in 1919 would cost billions by 1923. Families carried money in wheelbarrows, only to find it worthless by evening. Children scavenged coal from train tracks. Middle-class citizens, once comfortable, sank into poverty. Anger turned into desperation. Desperation turned into hatred. The United States, which had entered the war late, withdrew into isolation. Europe was left to heal itself, but healing never came. France demanded German payments to rebuild its destroyed countryside. Germany protested it could not pay without collapsing entirely. When it defaulted, French troops marched into the Ruhr Valley, seizing factories and mines. Violence erupted between soldiers and civilians. The wounds of war reopened. At the same time, radical ideologies began to spread like wildfire. In Russia, the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917 had created the world's first communist state. Across Europe, workers went on strike, inspired by the promise of equality. To the right, nationalists and fascists saw communism as a threat that had to be destroyed. The political center weakened. Extremes began to dominate. In Italy, Benito Mussolini rose to power in 1922, promising to restore order and pride through authoritarian rule. His success inspired movements elsewhere. In Germany, secret groups of disillusioned soldiers formed paramilitary organizations, Freikorps, fighting communists in the streets and dreaming of a new empire. Among them was a young Austrian veteran named Adolf Hitler. But in the early 1920s, few paid attention to him. The world was busy rebuilding or pretending to. The League of Nations, founded to prevent future wars, was weak and divided. The United States refused to join. Without unity or enforcement, it was a symbol of peace with no power to protect it. By the late 1920s, a fragile stability seemed to return. Factories reopened. Borders settled. People wanted to believe the nightmare was over. But beneath the surface, resentment festered. Every German child learned that their homeland had been shamed. Every French child was taught to fear a future German attack. Every politician spoke of peace but prepared for another war. Then came 1929. The Great Depression hit like a second explosion. The American stock market collapsed, and with it, the global economy. Millions lost their jobs. In Germany, the already wounded economy fell to its knees. Poverty deepened, and faith in democracy crumbled. People no longer trusted words or promises. They wanted strength. They wanted someone to blame. That desire would soon find its answer. The bitterness of Versailles, the chaos of revolution, the hunger of depression. All of it combined into a single question that echoed across the world. Who would restore pride? Who would rebuild the nation? In Munich beer halls and political rallies, a familiar voice began to answer. A man who claimed he could make Germany rise again. A man who promised revenge against those who had betrayed the fatherland. The guns of 1918 had fallen silent, but their echoes had not faded. They were waiting beneath the rubble, inside every broken family, in every angry crowd. The peace after the First World War was not peace at all. It was an intermission between tragedies. A quiet pause before history's deadliest storm began again. In June 1919, in the glittering Hall of Mirrors at the Palace of Versailles, the victors of the First World War gathered to sign what they believed would guarantee peace. The chandeliers gleamed, cameras flashed, and delegates wore expressions of triumph. But outside the palace gates, thousands of German citizens stood in silent rage. Inside, Germany's representatives faced a document they had no power to change. A treaty that would humiliate their nation and set the fuse for the next great conflict. The Treaty of Versailles was not a negotiation. It was an ultimatum. Germany had been excluded from the drafting sessions. It was told to sign or face invasion. When the German delegation read the terms, they were stunned. The treaty declared Germany solely responsible for the war under Article 231, the War Guilt Clause. This single sentence would haunt an entire generation. It demanded that Germany pay reparations so immense they were mathematically impossible to fulfill. 132 billion gold marks, a figure that could crush even a prosperous empire. The treaty went further. Germany's military was reduced to 100,000 men. Barely enough to maintain order, let alone defend its borders. The Navy was stripped to a few small ships. The Air Force was abolished completely. Heavy artillery, tanks, and submarines were banned. The Rhineland, Germany's industrial heart, was demilitarized and occupied by Allied troops. Territories were carved away. Alsace-Lorraine returned to France. The Saar Basin placed under League of Nations control. The Polish corridor split Germany in two. Colonies in Africa and the Pacific were seized and handed to Britain, France, and Japan. In Berlin, the reaction was outrage. Newspapers called it the Versailles Diktat. German politicians debated rejecting the treaty, but the Allied blockade continued to starve the population. With no choice, the Weimar Republic signed it on June 28, 1919, the fifth anniversary of Archduke Franz Ferdinand's assassination, the event that had started the First War. The symbolism was deliberate. Humiliation engraved into history. For ordinary Germans, Versailles became a national wound. Veterans returning from the trenches refused to believe they had been defeated on the battlefield. They believed their army had been betrayed by weak politicians, leftist agitators, and Jewish financiers, a poisonous myth known as the stab-in-the-back legend. This lie, repeated endlessly, corroded faith in democracy and fed the fire of radical nationalism. Economically, the treaty's demands were disastrous. In 1921, the first reparation payments began. Gold, coal, and raw materials were shipped out of Germany in endless trains. To meet quotas, the government printed money without restraint, triggering one of the worst hyperinflations in human history. By 1923, workers were paid twice a day because prices doubled every few hours. Housewives carried bundles of banknotes in baskets. Children used money as toys, stacking worthless bills into towers. A single loaf of bread could cost trillions of marks. Life savings vanished overnight. In the Ruhr Valley, France and Belgium occupied German mines and factories to enforce payment. German workers went on strike, and the government supported them by printing more money, deepening the crisis. Violence erupted between striking workers, police, and paramilitary groups. Hunger and chaos spread. Faith in the Weimar Republic evaporated. Democracy, for millions, came to mean weakness and humiliation. Meanwhile, the Allies believed the treaty was just. France wanted security. Its land had been devastated by war. Britain sought to maintain balance but feared German recovery. The United States, under President Wilson, had proposed a fairer peace. 14 points built on self-determination and justice. But the European victors rejected much of his vision. Wilson returned home defeated, and America turned inward, leaving Europe to handle its own wounds. The result was not peace but resentment institutionalized. Every child in Germany learned that their future had been stolen. Schoolbooks called the treaty a curse. Propaganda painted the Allies as greedy, hypocritical oppressors. Political extremists found easy targets. The traitors of Weimar, the Jews, the communists, the bankers. The anger united millions who had lost everything into a single demand: revenge. By the mid-1920s, Germany struggled to survive under the weight of reparations and shame. International attempts to ease the burden, the Dawes Plan in 1924, the Young Plan in 1929, offered temporary relief but no dignity. Germans wanted not compromise, but redemption. Every speech, every protest, every newspaper headline carried the same message: Versailles must be destroyed. In 1930, when the Great Depression swept the world, Germany's fragile economy collapsed again. Factories closed, unemployment soared, and despair deepened. In beer halls and rallies, angry men spoke of betrayal and vengeance. Among them, one voice rose above the rest: a veteran who had fought in the Great War and who knew how to turn humiliation into power. Adolf Hitler called the treaty a crime against humanity, a deliberate effort to enslave the German people. His words ignited the fury buried since 1919. By the early 1930s, the Versailles trap had fully closed. The treaty meant to ensure peace had instead created conditions for another, far deadlier war. The Allies had chained Germany's body but strengthened its hatred. Versailles did not prevent conflict, it delayed it, compressing it into something explosive. In 1933, Hitler came to power on a promise to break those chains. He vowed to restore pride, rebuild the army, reclaim lost lands, and erase the humiliation of Versailles forever. Crowds filled the streets chanting his name, believing he would set them free from the memory of that cursed hall in Versailles. The chandeliers of 1919 still glimmered, but their light had blinded the victors. What they thought was justice had become vengeance. What they believed was peace had become a trap, one that would soon explode across the world once more. The year was 1919. Germany was broken, humiliated, and leaderless. Its soldiers returned from the trenches not as heroes but as remnants of a defeated empire. The Kaiser had fled to exile in the Netherlands, the monarchy was gone, and a fragile new democracy, the Weimar Republic, was struggling to stand. Hunger, unemployment, and political violence turned the streets into battlefields. And in that chaos, a failed artist and former soldier named Adolf Hitler began his ascent from obscurity. Hitler was born in Austria in 1889, far from the centers of power. He was a dreamer with no clear path, a man who failed to enter art school and lived in poverty in Vienna before the First World War. But during that time, he absorbed dangerous ideas: nationalism, racial superiority, and hatred toward Jews. When war came in 1914, he enlisted in the German army and found his purpose. For him, the trenches were not just battlefields but a sense of belonging he had never known. When Germany surrendered in 1918, Hitler was hospitalized, temporarily blinded by a gas attack. There, he heard the news of defeat. He wept, not for the dead, but for the collapse of the Germany he worshipped. In that moment, he swore vengeance. Returning to Munich in 1919, Hitler joined a small nationalist organization, the German Workers' Party. It was one of dozens of radical groups that emerged in the ashes of defeat, mixing anti-Semitism, anti-communism, and rage against Versailles. Hitler quickly proved himself a powerful orator. His speeches were not calm arguments. They were explosions of fury. He shouted about betrayal, about the stab in the back, about restoring pride to a humiliated people. His words electrified audiences of veterans, workers, and the unemployed. Within 2 years, he became the party's dominant voice. In 1920, he renamed it the National Socialist German Workers' Party, known to history as the Nazi Party. Its emblem became the swastika, its salute a symbol of unity and submission. Hitler organized paramilitary groups, the SA, the Brown Shirts, who marched through the streets, intimidating opponents and clashing with communists. The streets of Munich became a theater of chaos. Red flags of the communists on one side, brown uniforms of the Nazis on the other. In 1923, Hitler made his first attempt to seize power. Inspired by Mussolini's March on Rome, he launched the Beer Hall Putsch, a failed coup in Munich. He and his followers stormed a local government meeting, declaring a revolution. But the police opened fire. 16 Nazis were killed. Hitler was arrested and charged with treason. Many thought his political career was over. Instead, prison became his platform. During his 9 months in Landsberg prison, Hitler dictated Mein Kampf, My Struggle. The book laid out his worldview in brutal clarity. Racial purity, hatred of Jews, the need for dictatorship, and the dream of a greater German empire that would conquer Eastern Europe for living space. It was a manifesto of revenge disguised as destiny. When he was released, few took him seriously. The Nazi Party was banned, its leaders scattered. Germany seemed to move on. But beneath the surface, the country remained fragile. The hyperinflation crisis of 1923 had wiped out savings and destroyed trust in the government. The late 1920s brought brief recovery under the Dawes Plan, but it was built on foreign loans, mainly from the United States. When the Great Depression struck in 1929, those loans vanished. Factories closed. Unemployment soared. By 1932, more than 6 million Germans were jobless. Bread lines stretched for blocks. Democracy, to the desperate, began to look like failure. The Nazis seized the moment. Hitler's message, blaming Jews, communists, and traitorous politicians, resonated with a nation drowning in despair. His speeches promised not just jobs, but pride. He spoke of unity, strength, and vengeance. His rallies were grand spectacles. Banners, torches, music, and choreographed salutes. The people no longer listened to words. They surrendered to emotion. The Nazi Party grew from a fringe movement to a mass force. In the 1930 elections, they won 18% of the vote. 2 years later, they became the largest party in the Reichstag. Yet Hitler still lacked absolute power. Conservative elites, businessmen, military leaders, and aristocrats believed they could use him as a tool. They thought they could control him. They were wrong. On January 30th, 1933, under pressure from these same elites, President Paul von Hindenburg appointed Adolf Hitler Chancellor of Germany. The appointment was meant to stabilize the government. Instead, it doomed the republic. Within weeks, the Nazis moved to destroy all opposition. The Reichstag fire in February 1933, an act of arson blamed on communists, became Hitler's excuse to seize emergency powers. Civil liberties were suspended. Political rivals were arrested. Newspapers were censored. In March, the Enabling Act was passed, granting Hitler authority to rule by decree. The Weimar Constitution effectively died that day. The Nazi dictatorship was born not through a revolution, but through legal manipulation and fear. Within a year, all political parties except the Nazis were banned. Trade unions were dissolved. The Gestapo, Hitler's secret police, was created to crush dissent. Germany had transformed from democracy to dictatorship in less than 12 months. By 1934, Hitler consolidated power entirely. When President Hindenburg died that August, Hitler merged the offices of Chancellor and President, declaring himself Führer, leader of the German Reich. The army swore personal loyalty not to the Constitution, but to him. Those who had underestimated him were gone, imprisoned, exiled, or dead. The man who had once shouted in beer halls now stood as the master of a nation. His words were law, his image omnipresent. Propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels reshaped reality through film, radio, and posters. Children learned to salute the Führer before learning to read. Germany marched again, not yet to war, but toward it with unwavering precision. By the mid-1930s, the world watched in uneasy silence. Hitler had promised peace while secretly rebuilding the military, violating Versailles clause by clause. Factories that once made tractors now built tanks. Airfields reappeared. The swastika flew over cities that had once mourned defeat. The rise of a dictator was complete. He had not taken power by force but by exploiting fear, humiliation, and chaos. The world that ignored him after 1919 now faced the consequence of its blindness. The stage was set. The revenge of Versailles had found its instrument, and soon the world would feel its wrath. By 1934, Adolf Hitler had become the undisputed leader of Germany. But his ambitions went far beyond restoring his country's pride. Deep within the pages of Mein Kampf and the fiery speeches he gave to adoring crowds lay a vision, one not just of national revival but of domination. It was an ideology built on conquest, blood, and myth. The roots of Hitler's ideology were tangled in old German fears and dreams. He believed the German people, the Aryan race, were destined to rule the world. To him, history was a battlefield between races, not nations, a constant struggle for survival in which only the strongest could endure. He claimed that peace, compassion, and equality were lies told by the weak to restrain the strong. Germany, he said, had been betrayed in 1918 by Jews, Marxists, and liberals, a poisonous mixture that had weakened the nation. The only cure, in his eyes, was purification through war. The idea of Lebensraum, living space, became central to this doctrine. Hitler insisted that Germany's destiny lay to the east. The fertile lands of Poland, Ukraine, and Russia were to be conquered and colonized. The people who lived there, Slavs, Jews, and others he deemed inferior, would be enslaved or eliminated. It was not politics. It was a plan for racial empire. To Hitler, conquering the East was not a choice. It was nature's law. In countless speeches throughout the 1930s, he repeated this vision to cheering crowds. The German people must fight, he declared. because it is only through struggle that a race becomes great. These words were more than rhetoric. They became government policy. The Nazi state rewired every part of society to serve this dream of conquest. Schools taught racial biology, that Aryans were the pinnacle of creation, while Jews and others were subhuman. Children learned that war was noble, that dying for Germany was the highest honor. In 1935, the Nuremberg Laws officially stripped Jews of citizenship, forbade marriage between Jews and non-Jews, and declared them subjects of the Reich. This was the beginning of legal persecution, the transformation of hatred into law. Propaganda posters depicted Jews as parasites, Bolsheviks as monsters, and Germans as heroic warriors. Films, textbooks, and radio all repeated the same message. Germany had been betrayed, and only through unity and war could it rise again. The ideology also reached deep into the army. Though many generals had sworn loyalty to the old Kaiser, they now pledged allegiance personally to Hitler. Military academies taught that Germany's survival depended on expansion. Hitler surrounded himself with men who shared or exploited his ideas: Himmler, Göring, Goebbels, each shaping the machinery of the new Reich. Heinrich Himmler, head of the SS, envisioned a racial order where only the pure would thrive. He saw the coming wars as a cleansing fire that would reshape Europe. Meanwhile, the Nazis began to test their vision abroad. In 1936, Hitler ordered the reoccupation of the Rhineland, a zone demilitarized by the Treaty of Versailles. The German army marched in without resistance. The world protested but did nothing. France hesitated. Britain hoped for peace. Hitler watched carefully and learned a critical lesson. The Allies would not stop him. Emboldened, he pushed further. That same year, Germany entered into alliances with Italy's Benito Mussolini and Japan, forming the Axis powers. Each believed in conquest as destiny. To Hitler, Mussolini's fascism was proof that strong men could reshape nations. To Japan, expansion into China and the Pacific was part of the same global struggle. The ideology of conquest was no longer isolated, it was spreading. At home, the German people were swept up in a wave of fanaticism. Massive rallies in Nuremberg displayed thousands of soldiers, flags, and blazing torches. Goebbels' propaganda machine turned these spectacles into emotional theater. Every speech, every banner, every drumbeat was designed to make the crowd feel invincible, part of something greater than themselves. Ordinary citizens felt reborn under Hitler's rule. The shame of defeat was gone. In its place burned a dangerous pride. By 1937, Germany's military buildup was unstoppable. The Luftwaffe, its air force, had risen from nothing to one of the most advanced in the world. New tanks, aircraft, and weapons rolled off production lines in secret factories. Hitler poured resources into research and development, demanding machines that could crush any enemy. Behind this expansion, however, was not just preparation for war, it was a crusade. The Nazi ideology taught that the world itself must be remade. Jews were the eternal enemy, communism was a disease, and democracy was weakness. Hitler saw himself as chosen by fate to cleanse humanity. He told his generals, "We must be hard. We must learn to kill without pity." The idea of conquest was no longer about land, it was about survival through destruction. In 1938, the ideology took its first major victim. Austria, Hitler's homeland, was annexed in the Anschluss. German troops crossed the border without a fight. Crowds cheered, believing they were joining a glorious future. Austria ceased to exist overnight. The world again remained silent. Hitler called it the return of German blood. Next came Czechoslovakia. Hitler claimed that the German-speaking population of the Sudetenland was being mistreated. At the Munich conference, Britain and France, desperate to avoid war, agreed to give him the territory in exchange for a promise of peace. Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain returned to London declaring, "Peace for our time." But Hitler saw Munich not as peace, but as proof of weakness. Inside the Reich Chancellery, Hitler's plans grew darker. He told his generals that Germany must prepare for total war, not just against countries but against entire peoples. His generals hesitated, but none dared oppose him. The ideology of conquest had become the law of the land. To question it was treason. The German people, blinded by propaganda and fear, believed they were unstoppable. Every victory seemed to confirm their destiny. The dream of empire was no longer a dream, it was policy. The factories roared, the soldiers drilled, the banners waved, and the world held its breath. By the end of 1938, Hitler's ideology of conquest had fully transformed Germany. It had united millions under a single purpose: to fight, to expand, and to dominate. Yet behind the triumphal marches and shining steel was a nightmare waiting to unfold. The dream of a thousand-year Reich would soon drag the world into the deadliest conflict in human history. For now, the world still believed peace could be saved. But Hitler's mind was already set. His next step would ignite a fire no nation could contain. By 1936, the world had already been warned. Hitler's Germany had torn up the Treaty of Versailles, rebuilt its army, and marched troops into the demilitarized Rhineland. It was a direct violation of international law, yet not a single shot was fired in response. The British and French governments watched in silence. The League of Nations, created after World War I to preserve peace, issued nothing more than statements of concern. For Hitler, this silence was louder than any applause. It meant he could do whatever he wanted. The Western powers were paralyzed by fear, fear of another war, fear of their own weakness, fear of public opinion. In Britain, the trauma of the First World War still haunted every family. Over 1 million British soldiers had died in the trenches, and no one wanted to see their sons march to another slaughter. Newspapers and politicians repeated the same desperate mantra: no more war. Peace had become the new god, even if it meant closing their eyes to growing evil. France, meanwhile, was politically divided and economically exhausted. Governments fell one after another, unable to form a united front. Many French leaders believed the Maginot Line, a vast system of fortifications along the German border, would protect them. They convinced themselves that defense was enough, that diplomacy could handle the rest. But history would prove them wrong. In 1936, Hitler's troops entered the Rhineland with orders to retreat if France reacted. They didn't need to. France did nothing. Hitler later told his generals, "If they had resisted, we would have had to withdraw. Our military was not ready." The world had missed its last easy chance to stop him. The League of Nations, meant to prevent exactly this kind of aggression, had become a hollow institution. It had failed to stop Japan's invasion of Manchuria in 1931 and did nothing when Italy attacked Ethiopia in 1935. Dictators across the globe saw the pattern. Aggression paid, and the democracies were too weak to act. In London, Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin and later Neville Chamberlain believed that Germany's demands could be met through negotiation. They viewed Hitler as a rational man who wanted to revise the unfair parts of the Versailles Treaty. Many in Britain's elite even saw him as a useful barrier against communism, which they feared more than fascism. Diplomats told themselves that Hitler's anger was understandable, that he only wanted justice for Germany. The truth was far darker. Hitler's goals were not about justice or equality. They were about conquest and domination. But few in Europe wanted to believe it. The memory of 1914, the trenches, the poison gas, the millions of dead was too painful. Peace at any cost seemed better than the risk of another world war. This policy became known as appeasement. Its logic was simple but deadly. If Germany's grievances were met, It would be satisfied and peace would endure. In practice, it meant surrendering bit by bit to Hitler's demands. In 1938, the first great test of appeasement came. Hitler demanded the annexation of Austria, the Anschluss. He claimed it was the will of the Austrian people that Germans on both sides of the border should be united. Austria's government tried to resist, but the pressure was overwhelming. On March 12, 1938, German troops crossed the border. There was no battle. Crowds cheered in Vienna as Nazi flags filled the streets. Austria was gone in a day. Britain and France protested but did nothing. Chamberlain told Parliament that Austria was a matter of internal German concern. The world moved on. Hitler had learned again that he could expand without consequence. His next target was Czechoslovakia, specifically the Sudetenland, home to over 3 million ethnic Germans. Hitler claimed they were being oppressed and demanded the region be handed over. The Czechoslovak government refused, and for a moment war seemed imminent. But instead of standing firm, Britain and France sought compromise. Chamberlain flew to Germany to meet Hitler personally, convinced he could negotiate peace. The result was the Munich Agreement, signed in September 1938. Britain and France agreed to give Hitler the Sudetenland in exchange for his promise that he had no further territorial ambitions. Chamberlain returned to London waving the agreement, declaring peace for our time. Crowds cheered him as a hero, but Winston Churchill stood in Parliament and said grimly, "You were given the choice between war and dishonor. You chose dishonor, and you will have war." Churchill was right. Just 6 months later, in March 1939, Hitler broke his promise. German troops marched into Prague and occupied the rest of Czechoslovakia. It was no longer about protecting Germans. It was open conquest. The world had been deceived, but still, there was no decisive response. Meanwhile, Italy's Mussolini and Japan's military leaders saw Hitler's success and grew bolder. They too faced no serious opposition from the League or the Western powers. The balance of world power was shifting. Democracies were shrinking back while dictatorships advanced. In the United States, President Franklin D. Roosevelt watched anxiously but faced his own constraints. The American public was deeply isolationist, scarred by the Great Depression and the losses of the last war. Congress passed neutrality acts to prevent the U.S. from being drawn into European conflicts. The message to the world was clear. If another war broke out, America would stay out of it. Thus, by 1939, the world had failed completely. Every warning sign had been ignored. Each aggression had been excused. Each broken promise had been met with silence. The democratic nations had convinced themselves that morality could be traded for stability, that by feeding the wolf they could tame it. Inside Germany, Hitler's confidence became absolute. He saw himself as unstoppable, chosen by destiny to reshape the world. The generals who once doubted him now obeyed without question. The population, fed by endless propaganda, believed Germany was invincible. The failure of the world had become the triumph of tyranny. When Britain and France finally realized the truth, it was already too late. Hitler had gained power, resources, and allies, all without firing a single shot against them. The price of hesitation would soon be paid in blood. The failure was not only political, it was moral. The world had watched evil grow and chose to look away. They believed peace could be preserved through submission, but peace built on fear is only the illusion before collapse. In the spring of 1939, as German tanks prepared for their next move, Europe stood at the edge of disaster. A disaster built not only by Hitler's ambition but by the cowardice of those who refused to stop him. The world had failed to act when it mattered most. Within months, the silence would end. Not with speeches, but with the thunder of invasion, and the world would awaken to a war far deadlier than the last. By early 1938, Adolf Hitler's ambitions were no longer hidden behind diplomatic language or vague promises of peace. He had rebuilt Germany's army, restored national pride, and proven that Europe's democracies would not stop him. The question was no longer if he would expand, but where he would strike next. The first victim would be his own birthplace, Austria. For centuries, Austria had been part of the same cultural and linguistic world as Germany. Many Austrians still identified themselves as Germans, and Hitler exploited that sentiment. The Treaty of Versailles had specifically forbidden the unification of Germany and Austria, fearing it would create a dominant Central European power again. But by 1938, those restrictions were little more than paper barriers. Hitler saw the political instability inside Austria as the perfect opening. The Austrian Chancellor Kurt Schuschnigg tried to maintain independence, balancing between democracy and rising fascist pressure from within his country. Austrian Nazis, secretly funded and organized by Berlin, staged riots, propaganda campaigns, and acts of sabotage. They demanded unification with the Reich. The situation grew tense. In February 1938, Schuschnigg was summoned to Hitler's mountain retreat at Berchtesgaden. It was not a meeting, it was an ultimatum. For hours, Hitler shouted, threatened, and humiliated him. The message was clear. Unless Austria accepted Nazi control, Germany would invade. Under immense pressure, Schuschnigg agreed to appoint Nazi sympathizers to key government positions. But when he returned to Vienna, he tried to fight back. In a last act of defiance, he announced a national referendum. The Austrian people would vote on whether to remain independent. Hitler could not risk that. The plebiscite threatened to expose that many Austrians, despite Nazi claims, did not want annexation under Hitler's rule. On March 11, 1938, German forces were ordered to prepare for invasion. The next morning, the Wehrmacht crossed the border. There was no resistance. Crowds greeted the soldiers with flowers and Nazi salutes. Propaganda films captured jubilant Austrians welcoming the liberation. Schuschnigg was arrested, and Austria ceased to exist as a sovereign state. Hitler himself entered Vienna days later, standing before hundreds of thousands of cheering citizens in the Heldenplatz. He declared the Anschluss, the union of Germany and Austria, complete. For him, it was the fulfillment of destiny. For the world, it was another test. And once again, no one reacted. Britain and France protested but refused to act. The League of Nations stayed silent. Austria was gone without a single shot fired. The success emboldened Hitler. The world had confirmed what he already believed, that he could take what he wanted. His eyes now turned toward Czechoslovakia, a young democracy born after World War I. Unlike Austria, it had a strong army and fortified borders. But it also had a weakness, the Sudetenland. The Sudetenland, a mountainous border region, was home to about 3 million ethnic Germans. Hitler claimed they were being persecuted by the Czechoslovak government. In reality, he had no concern for their welfare. The Sudeten crisis was simply a pretext, another opportunity to expand without war. In the summer of 1938, Hitler began a campaign of intimidation. Nazi newspapers filled with stories of alleged Czech brutality against Germans. The propaganda was relentless, painting Hitler as the protector of his German brothers. Meanwhile, the Sudeten German Party, led by Konrad Henlein, followed direct orders from Berlin to provoke unrest. The Czechoslovak government, realizing the danger, mobilized its army. They hoped their allies, France and Britain, would stand by their defense treaties. But inside London and Paris, leaders were already seeking a way to avoid conflict. Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain believed that Hitler's demands were reasonable. After all, he argued, the Sudetenland was mostly German. Why risk another world war over a small piece of land? As tensions escalated, Europe once again stood at the edge of war. The world held its breath. Then, in September 1938, Chamberlain flew to Germany to meet Hitler at Berchtesgaden. It was an extraordinary act, the first time a British Prime Minister had ever flown abroad to negotiate directly with a foreign leader. Hitler repeated his demands. The Sudetenland must be given to Germany. Chamberlain, desperate to preserve peace, returned home believing he could broker a compromise. A second meeting followed at Godesberg, and Hitler increased his demands. Now he wanted immediate occupation of the territory. Britain began to prepare for the possibility of war, but Chamberlain still clung to hope. Finally, on September 29, 1938, representatives of Germany, Italy, Britain, and France gathered in Munich. Czechoslovakia was not even invited to the table. The result was the Munich Agreement, one of the most infamous documents in modern history. Britain and France agreed to give Hitler the Sudetenland in exchange for his promise that he would make no further territorial claims in Europe. Chamberlain returned to London, waving the agreement and declaring, "I believe it is peace for our time." Czechoslovakia was betrayed by its allies. Within days, German troops occupied the Sudetenland. Hitler's armies were greeted not by enemies but by order and silence. The world, once again, had chosen to yield. But Hitler was never satisfied. The Sudetenland had given him a strategic advantage. The rest of Czechoslovakia was now surrounded and defenseless. In March 1939, German forces marched into Prague. This time, it was clear that his ambitions were not about protecting Germans but conquering nations. The swastika now flew over Prague Castle. Czechoslovakia ceased to exist. This was the moment when the illusion of peace shattered. Britain and France finally realized that Hitler could not be appeased. He had broken every promise, every treaty, every assurance. Chamberlain's peace for our time had lasted only 6 months. Still, the democracies were unprepared for war. The military buildup was slow, and the political will was uncertain. Hitler, on the other hand, had gained resources, factories, and strategic depth. He now controlled the industrial heart of Central Europe. The road to full-scale war was wide open. Behind closed doors, Hitler began preparing his next move, the invasion of Poland. But before striking, he needed to secure his flank. In August 1939, he shocked the world by signing a non-aggression pact with his greatest ideological enemy, Joseph Stalin's Soviet Union. The secret protocol of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact divided Eastern Europe into spheres of influence. Poland would be split between Germany and the USSR. From the Rhineland to Austria, from the Sudetenland to Prague, each step had been part of a pattern. Aggression followed by appeasement, conquest followed by silence. The road to annexation was paved not just by Hitler's ambition, but by the world's fear. By the summer of 1939, Hitler had everything he needed: power, momentum, and the conviction that no one would stop him. Europe stood on the brink of the greatest war in history, a war born not in a single moment, but in a long series of annexations that the world chose to ignore. By the summer of 1939, Europe stood at the edge of catastrophe. Germany had swallowed Austria and Czechoslovakia with little resistance, and Hitler's gaze was now fixed on Poland. The invasion was inevitable, yet even Hitler understood the danger. If Germany attacked Poland, Britain and France would declare war. Germany could not fight them all, not while facing the Soviet Union on its eastern border. What Hitler needed was time. What he needed was Stalin. For years, Hitler had publicly denounced communism. In Mein Kampf, he described Bolshevism as a Jewish conspiracy designed to destroy civilization. The Nazi regime had spent years imprisoning and executing communists in Germany. To the world, Hitler and Stalin were mortal enemies. But politics in that dark summer was not about ideology, it was about survival and advantage. The Soviet Union, too, was watching the crisis unfold. Joseph Stalin did not trust the Western powers. He had seen how Britain and France allowed Hitler to tear apart Central Europe without resistance. In 1938, at Munich, they had betrayed Czechoslovakia, a country that bordered the Soviet sphere of influence. Stalin concluded that the West would never stand up to Germany until it was too late. If war was coming, the Soviet Union would not be the one to face it first. Behind closed doors, German diplomats began to test the waters. Could an agreement be made between two sworn enemies? At first, the idea seemed impossible. But Hitler was determined. On August 14, 1939, Joachim von Ribbentrop, Germany's foreign minister, sent a coded message to Moscow proposing a high-level meeting. Stalin's response was cautious but curious. He saw an opportunity to secure his borders, gain territory, and buy time to rebuild his army, still weakened after his brutal purges of the officer corps in 1937. What followed was one of the most cynical negotiations in modern history. In just a few days, diplomats from both nations drew up the framework of an agreement that would change the fate of Europe. Officially, it would be called the Treaty of Non-Aggression between Germany and the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. But history would know it by another name, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. On the night of August 23, 1939, Ribbentrop flew to Moscow under heavy secrecy. He was met by Vyacheslav Molotov, Stalin's foreign minister, and the negotiations lasted deep into the night. At midnight, the treaty was signed in the Kremlin, under Stalin's watchful eyes. The world was told only part of the truth. Germany and the Soviet Union had agreed not to attack each other for 10 years. But the most important part of the deal, the one that would ignite World War II, was hidden in a secret protocol. That secret clause divided Eastern Europe into spheres of influence. Poland would be split in two, the western half under German control, the eastern half under Soviet control. The Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and later Lithuania, were marked for Soviet occupation. Finland was placed in the Soviet sphere as well. In exchange, Germany would have a free hand to attack Poland without fear of Soviet intervention. It was a pact of shadows, a cold, ruthless bargain between two dictators who despised each other but understood power. When the news broke, the world was stunned. The two greatest ideological enemies, Fascist Germany and Communist Russia, had become allies. The Western powers were paralyzed by disbelief. Newspapers in London and Paris called it the betrayal of civilization. Hitler, however, was exultant. He told his generals, "Now I have them all. Poland is at our mercy." The pact gave Hitler the final piece he needed to unleash his war. Within a week of signing, the German army began mobilizing on Poland's western border. On September 1, 1939, the invasion began. At dawn, German planes bombed Polish cities and armored divisions, the panzer units, rolled across the countryside. Within days, Warsaw was under siege. Britain and France declared war on Germany, but their response was symbolic. They launched no major offensives. The war had begun, but the West still hesitated to act decisively. Meanwhile, Stalin watched from the east, waiting for the right moment. 17 days later, on September 17, 1939, Soviet forces crossed Poland's eastern border. Under the secret terms of the pact, they occupied their assigned half of the country. The Red Army claimed it was protecting the Ukrainian and Belarusian populations, but in truth, it was completing the destruction of an independent nation. Polish soldiers trapped between two invading armies had no chance. Within weeks, the Polish state ceased to exist. The partnership between Hitler and Stalin was pragmatic but poisonous. They traded resources. Germany sent industrial equipment and weapons, while the Soviet Union supplied oil, grain, and raw materials. Trains crossed the borders daily, carrying goods that fueled Germany's war machine. Propaganda on both sides carefully avoided mentioning the pact's darker implications. Behind the scenes, darker deeds followed. In the spring of 1940, the Soviet secret police, the NKVD, executed over 20,000 captured Polish officers and intellectuals in what became known as the Katyn Massacre. The goal was to eliminate the leadership class of Poland, to ensure that resistance could never rise again. The German occupation was equally brutal. Executions, deportations, and the early seeds of the Holocaust began to take root. For Hitler, the pact was a temporary tool. He despised communism and viewed the Soviets as a future enemy. But for now, the agreement allowed him to focus westward. Within months, German forces conquered Denmark, Norway, Belgium, the Netherlands, and France. The swastika flew over Paris. Europe was his. Stalin, meanwhile, expanded his reach into the Baltics and Finland, just as promised in the secret protocol. In November 1939, the Soviets invaded Finland in what became known as the Winter War. The Finns fought with incredible resilience, inflicting heavy losses on the Red Army despite being outnumbered. The conflict exposed the weakness of Stalin's purged military, but it also showed his ruthlessness. In the end, Finland was forced to cede territory to Moscow. As 1940 unfolded, the Pact of Shadows held firm, but unease was growing. Both dictators suspected betrayal. Hitler began to speak privately about the inevitable clash with Bolshevism. Stalin, though outwardly calm, ordered new defenses built along the western border, convinced that Germany would eventually turn east. By 1941, the alliance was cracking beneath its own hypocrisy. Hitler had already begun planning Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. He believed that destroying communism and conquering the East would fulfill his destiny. Stalin, blinded by his own miscalculations, refused to believe the warnings of an impending German attack. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, born in secrecy and deceit, was never meant to last. It was a pact between predators, united only by the convenience of devouring their prey. Yet for 2 years, it allowed Hitler and Stalin to reshape the map of Europe and unleash the most destructive war in human history. The shadows they cast in that August night of 1939 would stretch across the continent for generations, dividing nations, destroying millions of lives, and proving that even temporary alliances of evil can change the world forever. At dawn on September 1st, 1939, the world changed forever. The calm morning skies over Poland were suddenly filled with the roar of engines, the whine of dive bombers, and the thunder of artillery. Without warning, Nazi Germany unleashed its military might on the Polish Republic. The invasion, codenamed Fall Weiss, marked the beginning of World War II. The attack began at 4:45 a.m. when the German battleship Schleswig-Holstein, anchored near the port of Danzig, today's Gdansk, opened fire on the Polish garrison at Westerplatte. The first shells of the war crashed into Polish defenses, igniting fires and chaos. Within minutes, Luftwaffe squadrons appeared overhead, raining destruction on cities, bridges, and airfields. The plan was clear: crush Poland swiftly before the Allies could react. Hitler's strategy, known as Blitzkrieg, lightning war, was unlike anything the world had seen. It combined speed, coordination, and overwhelming force. Waves of tanks and motorized infantry tore through defenses, supported by relentless air attacks. The Polish army, though brave and determined, was no match for this new form of mechanized warfare. Their cavalry, symbols of national pride, faced German armor with little more than courage and outdated weapons. In Berlin, Hitler announced that Germany had been forced to act. He claimed Poland had attacked first, a lie carefully staged through the infamous Gleiwitz incident. German agents, dressed in Polish uniforms, had raided a German radio station near the border, broadcasting a fake Polish message. It was a crude trick, but it gave Hitler the propaganda excuse he needed. The truth mattered little. The invasion had been planned for months. Across Poland, resistance was fierce but desperate. In the north, the city of Danzig fell within hours. In the west, German panzers from the 10th Army sliced through Polish lines near Lodz and Poznan. The Luftwaffe dominated the skies, destroying communication lines and bombing refugees fleeing east. Civilians crowded roads with carts and bicycles, carrying whatever they could: food, blankets, photographs, as the thunder of German armor drew closer. Despite being outnumbered and outgunned, Polish soldiers fought with extraordinary courage. The defense of Westerplatte became legendary. Fewer than 200 Polish troops held out for 7 days against thousands of German soldiers, refusing to surrender until their ammunition ran out. In Warsaw, civilians joined soldiers to build barricades and man anti-aircraft guns as the city endured wave after wave of Luftwaffe bombings. The old capital became a symbol of resistance, defiant even in destruction. Britain and France, bound by treaty to defend Poland, declared war on Germany on September 3, 1939. Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain's voice echoed across the radio. "This country is at war with Germany." But beyond words, there was little action. The Allies launched no immediate offensive. The French army remained behind the Maginot Line, waiting, and the British Expeditionary Force moved cautiously into France. To the Poles, this phony war was a bitter disappointment. They were alone. Meanwhile, in Moscow, Joseph Stalin watched events unfold according to plan. Under the secret terms of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, the Soviet Union was waiting for the right moment to strike from the east. As Poland's defenses crumbled under German assault, Stalin prepared to seize his share. On September 17, 1939, the Red Army crossed the eastern border. Soviet troops poured into Polish territory under the pretense of protecting minorities. In reality, it was an invasion as deliberate as Hitler's. The Polish government, trapped between two totalitarian powers, realized the nation was lost. "We have been betrayed by geography," one general said bitterly. For Polish soldiers and civilians alike, the dual invasion was a nightmare. German forces advanced from the west, Soviet troops from the east. Villages were burned, prisoners executed, and civilians terrorized. In many towns, desperate units of the Polish army tried to break through to Romania or Hungary, hoping to regroup abroad. But surrounded on all sides, their chances were slim. By late September, Warsaw was the last major city still resisting. Bombed relentlessly, its hospitals and schools turned into ruins. Food and water ran out, but morale held strong. The city's defenders refused to surrender, even as the Luftwaffe reduced entire districts to rubble. Finally, on September 27th, after weeks of siege, Warsaw capitulated. More than 25,000 civilians were dead. On October 6, 1939, the last organized Polish units surrendered near Koch. In just 5 weeks, Poland had been crushed, divided between Germany and the Soviet Union as agreed in their secret pact. Hitler triumphantly toured the conquered land, watching German soldiers raise the swastika over Polish cities. He told his generals, "We have achieved in a few weeks what our fathers could not do in years." But the victory was soaked in blood. Poland's losses were immense. More than 200,000 soldiers killed or wounded, thousands of civilians dead, and millions displaced. The German occupation began immediately, marked by cruelty and terror. The SS and Gestapo moved in behind the army, rounding up intellectuals, priests, and community leaders. Whole villages were executed as examples. The occupation's goal was not just control, it was destruction of Polish identity. In the Soviet zone, the repression was equally brutal. The NKVD deported hundreds of thousands of Poles to Siberia and Kazakhstan. In the forests of Katyn in 1940, over 20,000 captured Polish officers and scholars would be executed, a massacre designed to erase the country's leadership. The fall of Poland sent shockwaves through the world. For the first time since 1918, Europe was again engulfed in total war. The Blitzkrieg had proven devastatingly effective, demonstrating the terrifying power of modern warfare. Old tactics and alliances crumbled overnight. The speed and precision of Germany's campaign left generals across the continent stunned and terrified. For Hitler, the victory confirmed his belief in destiny. In Berlin, crowds cheered, convinced that the war would be short and glorious. But within the walls of the Reich Chancellery, Hitler's ambitions already stretched beyond Poland. He told his staff that the conquest of Europe had only just begun. In London and Paris, the mood was grim. The Allied declarations of war had changed nothing on the battlefield. Their armies were intact but inactive, facing Germany across the quiet Western Front. Few realized that this silence was only temporary, a calm before the coming storm that would consume all of Europe. And in the ruins of Warsaw, a quiet determination began to grow. The Polish people, defeated but unbroken, whispered a single word that would define their struggle in the years to come: resistance. The spark that ignited the Second World War had been struck. The flames would soon engulf the world. The invasion of Poland had begun as a European crisis, but within months, it transformed into a global catastrophe. What started as a regional war between Germany, Britain, and France soon drew in every major power across the world. Empires, alliances, colonies, and oceans became part of a single, all-consuming conflict, the Second World War. In the autumn of 1939, after Poland's fall, a strange quiet settled over Western Europe. The British called it the Phony War. The Germans called it the Sitzkrieg, the Sitting War. Both sides waited behind their defensive lines, unsure who would strike first. British and French troops sat in the cold trenches of the Maginot Line, while across the border, German divisions stood ready behind the Siegfried Line. Europe seemed trapped in a moment of tension, the calm before a storm no one could yet imagine. But Hitler was already planning his next moves. Poland had fallen faster than expected, and his confidence soared. He ordered preparations for new offensives, first against Scandinavia, then the West. His goal was clear: to secure Germany's dominance over all of Europe before turning against the Soviet Union. In April 1940, the storm broke. German troops invaded Denmark and Norway, using a mix of surprise, speed, and deception. Denmark fell in less than 6 hours. Norway fought bravely but was overrun within 2 months. The Allies attempted to intervene, landing troops in Narvik, but their efforts collapsed under Luftwaffe bombing and naval superiority. The occupation of Norway gave Hitler control of the North Sea and access to Swedish iron ore, vital for his war industry. Then came the assault on the West. On May 10, 1940, the German Blitzkrieg struck Belgium, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, and France. The attack was swift and devastating. Allied defenses, based on the belief that the Maginot Line was impenetrable, were outflanked through the Ardennes forest, a region they thought tanks could never cross. Within days, German panzers had broken through, cutting off British and French forces in Belgium. The fall of France was one of history's greatest shocks. Paris, the heart of European civilization, fell within 6 weeks. The German army marched under the Arc de Triomphe, while French officials signed an armistice in the same railway carriage where Germany had surrendered in 1918, a deliberate act of humiliation. Europe now stood under Hitler's control. Only Britain remained defiant, Across the Channel, Winston Churchill took office as Prime Minister. In his first speech to Parliament, he declared, "I have nothing to offer but blood, toil, tears, and sweat." Britain prepared for invasion. The summer of 1940 became known as the Battle of Britain. For the first time, the world saw a war fought entirely in the skies. The Royal Air Force, outnumbered and exhausted, fought off wave after wave of German bombers. In September, after months of heavy losses, Hitler postponed his invasion plans. Britain had survived barely, but while Europe burned, the war's front lines were already expanding far beyond it. In North Africa, Italy, now Hitler's ally, invaded Egypt from its colony in Libya, seeking to seize control of the Suez Canal. The British struck back, defeating Italian forces and capturing thousands of prisoners. The desert became another theater of the war as German reinforcements, the Afrika Korps under General Erwin Rommel, arrived to turn the tide once more. In Eastern Europe, Stalin's Soviet Union expanded its influence under the secret terms of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. The Red Army occupied the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, and parts of Romania and Finland. The world now saw two totalitarian empires, Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, carving up Eastern Europe. But this uneasy partnership would not last. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, the United States watched from a distance. The American people, scarred by the losses of World War I, favored neutrality. President Franklin D. Roosevelt, however, saw the danger of isolation. Through the Lend-Lease Act, he began sending weapons, food, and ships to Britain, declaring the U.S. to be the arsenal of democracy. Though America was not yet at war, its factories were already fueling the Allied cause. By 1941, the conflict's reach stretched across oceans. In the Balkans, Germany invaded Yugoslavia and Greece to secure its southern flank. In North Africa, tanks battled across endless deserts. In the Atlantic, German U-boats prowled beneath the waves, hunting Allied convoys and threatening Britain's lifeline. Then, in June 1941, Hitler broke his pact with Stalin. Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union, began on June 22. 3 million German soldiers, supported by 500,000 Axis allies, crossed the border in the largest invasion in human history. Within weeks, vast Soviet territories fell, millions of soldiers were captured, and entire cities burned. Hitler's armies advanced toward Moscow and Leningrad, confident of swift victory. But the Soviet Union refused to die. By the winter of 1941, the Eastern Front had become a frozen nightmare. Temperatures plunged below -30°C, machinery froze, and German soldiers faced a brutal resistance they had not expected. The Red Army, regrouped and reinforced, launched a counterattack before Moscow, halting the German advance. The Blitzkrieg had met its first true failure. And then, in the Pacific, another empire made its move. On December 7, 1941, Japan launched a surprise attack on the American naval base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. Within hours, the Pacific Ocean erupted into war. U.S. battleships burned in the harbor, more than 2,400 Americans were dead, and the United States, once reluctant, now entered the conflict. The next day, Roosevelt addressed Congress, calling December 7th a date which will live in infamy. The U.S. declared war on Japan. Soon after, Germany and Italy declared war on the United States. The Second World War had officially become global. From Europe to Asia, from Africa to the Pacific, no continent remained untouched. Cities burned from London to Shanghai. Armies clashed in deserts and jungles, and civilians everywhere became targets. The old world order collapsed under the weight of destruction. What had begun with the invasion of Poland now spanned continents and oceans. Empires rose and fell. Nations were occupied, liberated, and destroyed. The war was no longer just a struggle between armies. It was a battle for the future of civilization itself. By the end of 1941, the lines were drawn. On one side, the Axis, Germany, Italy, and Japan, driven by conquest and ideology. On the other, the Allies, Britain, the Soviet Union, China, and now the United States, united by survival. The war that began in Europe had consumed the planet. What followed would decide not just who ruled nations, but what kind of world would emerge from the ashes. When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, the world stood among the ruins of a civilization that had nearly destroyed itself. Tens of millions were dead, soldiers, civilians, children, entire families, wiped from the earth by 6 years of relentless war. Cities lay in ashes, economies were shattered, and the map of humanity had been rewritten with blood. Out of the smoke and silence rose one haunting question: who was truly responsible for the Second World War? At first glance, the answer seemed obvious. Adolf Hitler, the dictator who had dragged the world into chaos, stood at the center of the storm. His vision of conquest, his hatred, and his obsession with racial purity had ignited a conflict of unprecedented scale. But to understand how it truly began, one must look beyond a single man, to the systems, decisions, and failures that allowed him to rise and the world to burn. When Hitler came to power in 1933, he was not yet the unstoppable tyrant history remembers. He was a product of Germany's humiliation after World War I. A nation broken by the Treaty of Versailles, crushed under debt, stripped of its colonies, and humiliated before the world. The Allied powers, driven by revenge rather than justice, had created an environment where bitterness could fester. Millions of Germans lost their livelihoods. Inflation devoured savings, and democracy seemed powerless. In this fertile ground, Hitler's message of pride and restoration found eager ears. But responsibility cannot rest on Germany alone. The leaders of Britain and France, desperate to avoid another devastating conflict, followed a policy of appeasement, feeding Hitler's ambitions instead of confronting them. When he reoccupied the Rhineland in 1936, they protested but did nothing. When he annexed Austria in 1938, they called it self-determination. When he demanded the Sudetenland from Czechoslovakia, they handed it to him in the Munich Agreement, believing they had secured peace. In reality, they had only convinced Hitler that the world would not stop him. The Soviet Union, too, bears a shadow of blame. Stalin's regime, brutal and paranoid, saw opportunity in Germany's expansion. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact of August 1939, a cynical agreement between two totalitarian powers, divided Eastern Europe into spheres of control. When Hitler invaded Poland from the west, Stalin invaded from the east. Two dictators, sworn enemies in ideology, united in conquest. The pact gave Hitler the freedom to wage war without fear of a two-front battle, and with it, the fuse was lit. Beyond the governments, there was also the failure of societies themselves. Across Europe, nationalism, fear, and hatred grew unchecked. The Great Depression had turned millions toward extremism. In Germany, Italy, and Japan, propaganda replaced truth, and obedience replaced conscience. Ordinary people, driven by fear or ambition, participated in the machinery of destruction. Soldiers following orders, bureaucrats signing deportation lists, neighbors turning in neighbors. The war was not only the work of leaders. It was carried out by hands from every corner of the world. As the war unfolded, the lines of responsibility only deepened. Hitler's Germany committed crimes beyond comprehension. The Holocaust, the mass murder of 6 million Jews, along with millions of Poles, Slavs, Roma, disabled people, and political prisoners. Yet these atrocities required more than one man's orders. They demanded silence from millions, those who looked away, who believed the lies, or who found comfort in denial. But Hitler did not act in isolation. The ambitions of Imperial Japan spread the war to Asia and the Pacific. Japan's leaders sought domination over China, Southeast Asia, and the Pacific Islands, justifying their conquests under the false banner of liberation. The attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941 brought the United States into the war. But long before that, Japanese forces had already slaughtered hundreds of thousands in China, most infamously in the Nanjing Massacre. Their cruelty matched Europe's darkest horrors. Italy, under Mussolini, joined the Axis out of greed for empire. His armies invaded Ethiopia in 1935 and later joined Hitler's wars, seeking glory but spreading only ruin. The fascist ideology that bound these regimes together, glorifying violence, obedience, and conquest, was not born in a vacuum. It reflected a broader sickness in the modern world, the worship of power over humanity. When the Allies finally triumphed, the victors turned to justice. The Nuremberg trials, held in 1945 to 1946, became the first international attempt to hold leaders accountable for crimes against humanity. 22 major Nazi officials faced judgment. 12 were sentenced to death. For the first time in history, a court declared that following orders was no defense for atrocities. The message was clear. Responsibility rests on individuals, not just nations. Yet justice, though necessary, could not erase the moral weight of what had happened. The war's causes stretched far beyond the courtroom. The greed of empires, the failures of diplomacy, the blindness of citizens, all played their part. The Second World War was not born in a single moment, but in decades of arrogance, fear, and neglect. In the ruins of Berlin, as the ashes of the Reich fell to the ground, those who survived faced the legacy of their choices. Some claimed ignorance, others claimed obedience, a few admitted guilt, but the deeper truth lay in what the world had allowed itself to become. When people surrender their moral judgment to ideology, when nations value pride above peace, and when fear silences truth, war becomes inevitable. Responsibility for the Second World War, therefore, cannot be confined to borders or names. It belongs to humanity itself, to the failure to learn from the past, to recognize danger when it rises, and to act before it consumes everything. In the decades that followed, the world swore, never again. The United Nations was formed to preserve peace. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights was written to protect human dignity. Yet the lessons of history remain fragile, easily forgotten. The same seeds of hatred and ambition that once plunged the world into war still exist, waiting for neglect to let them grow again. The Second World War was not just a battle of armies. It was a reflection of the human condition. It showed how quickly civilization can collapse when truth, justice, and compassion are abandoned. And it left behind a warning carved into the memory of mankind. That responsibility for peace lies not only with leaders, but with every individual who chooses between silence and courage.